Hi, everybody. We're going to start with a little bit of a review before we go into today's topic. So, what we're going to do is we're going to connect our past assignments and past couple lessons and content all together, and we're going to really start seeing some connectivity here. So, by this point, we've already seen some of the philosophies of the anti-war protesters. You saw the document from Martin Luther King Jr. Again, obviously a major civil rights activist, so we're going to see a little overlap there. You also read one from a man by the name of John Kerry, who's a modern day politician as well. Each of these men are just a glimpse of the anti-war movement that we're going to be looking at. And so when we're taking a look at this movement, we need to really start with the context. So what's really going on in the world when this anti-war protest movement arises? So we talk about the presidents that were in charge during Vietnam. We see that there was some early kind of involvement of the United States under Eisenhower and Kennedy, but really when we talk about the Vietnam War, we call it Johnson's War. It's really associated with Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, and then Nixon is going to take over afterward. And Richard Nixon is going to be the one who's going to end and get the United States out of the Vietnam War. But one of the biggest points, most controversial points we see in this photo in the bottom right here is called the My Lai Massacre. And you read an account and you watched a video from the History Channel describing what happened here, and it was so graphic, so awful of what happened. And it really, things like this really become highlighted by the people that are fighting against the war as justification for why the war is so terrible and why are these things happening? What are we fighting for when the U.S. soldiers are doing things like this? And so there's this big call to get America out of Vietnam, and Richard Nixon is in charge of this plan, and he calls it Vietnamization, which sounds like a made-up word, but Vietnamization is turning the war gradually over to the Vietnamese army, the South Vietnamese army, so that they can hopefully fight and repel against the North Korean forces or the Viet Cong fighting throughout Vietnam. So kind of making the war more Vietnamese, in control of them. And after the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese countries are still split between North Vietnam and South Vietnam when we exit the war. However, 2 years later, North Vietnam takes over South Vietnam and becomes unified under a single government, where now today we just have the country of Vietnam. It was united under a communist government. So when we left, yes, we could say that we accomplished our goal at the end of the day. It was very messy, it was sloppy, but we accomplished our goal. However, 2 years later, it was clear that we failed. We were not able to contain communism, and the Cold War raged on. So, we're going to really take a look at where this whole anti war movement really picks up, and it starts in the 1960s. There's a lot of stuff going on, right? By the 1960s, America had that immense wealth of the 1950s. So, think about like I Love Lucy and the 1950s era. The baby boom happened. So, all of these people being born right after World War II are now in their teenage or high school years, getting into the college years at the beginning of the 1960s. And so by the time the war picks up, all of these people born post World War II or in this 1950s prosperity era are going to be people that are going to be forced to go fight overseas. We have the issue of nuclear threats. We're still doing duck and cover drills, right? So the Cold War is still most definitely raging on. We have a lot of assassination of political leaders. JFK is killed in 1963. Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965. And JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, or Bobby Kennedy as he's known as, and Martin Luther King Jr. are assassinated in 1968, which is also the year that the Vietnam War becomes heightened to its most extreme level. We have all of the tensions over the civil rights movement that brew in the 1960s, not to mention all of this other stuff that's going on. You have this super controversial war in Vietnam. And so the 1960s are not a time of peace and prosperity. It's almost like the exact opposite of what we saw in the 1950s. Now, America is still doing well economically for the most part in the 1960s, but everything else is changing. It is massive social change, and not always is this good. There's a lot of tension. There are good things happening, like the civil rights movement enacting change, but there's so many other negative things swirling around it that it does get really drowned out. And what's unique about the 1960s is the massive amount of cultural change that happens so quickly. I love this photo you see here on the right because on the left, you see that man in the suit. That's kind of like what we would expect from a man in the 1950s. Clean cut, somebody you would see on like an episode of I Love Lucy. On the right, you see their kids, right? You see the youth movement brewing, which is a sharp contrast from the hair to the dressing to the value. Everything about them is so different. The cultural generational gap is so wide. It's the widest that it's ever been in previous history. And really, you think about why are these kids so different? Why are their values so different? Think about the world that they grew up in versus their parents. Their parents in the 1950s saw the Great Depression. They saw the economic collapse. They saw the Dust Bowl. They saw the rise and fall of like Hitler and Mussolini, and they saw Pearl Harbor. And they saw all of World War II. And so they're going to be much more conservative in their values in most of the Cold War. By the time these youth kind of come of age, they missed all that. They were born outside of that. It was a matter of circumstance. And what's unique about it as well is because they grew up in such a more prosperous age, most of these kids are going to through high school and graduating, and then most of them are going to college, whether they graduate or not. This is an alarmingly high rate compared to years past, and that's usually an amazing thing. However, this group of people who are the most educated, the largest group of Americans, generational group of Americans we have ever seen, right, the highest standard of living they've ever seen, are now starting to question the status quo. They have a lot more resources. They have a lot more materials at their disposal. They have higher education. They have higher access to things. And so they're going to be a very successful protest group. In addition to that, they're really going to try to reject the values of the 1950s, the expectations of their parents, and they're going to look for personal fulfillment. They're going to look to do whatever makes them happy, and it doesn't matter if it's weird, right? There was a movement or a phrase, or even like this button you see here in the bottom right-hand corner. Don't trust anyone over 30, right? Because they're just trying to force you back into a mold. They're just trying to control you and manipulate you. So this is real heavy skepticism here. And when we're talking about this movement of this youth movement that we're going to be talking about today, primarily the anti-war movement, right? We need to describe kind of what they were. We can just call them sort of the counterculture group, right? And we can talk about what does counterculture mean? It goes against the mainstream. So why does this group go against the mainstream? What are they rejecting? What are they going against? These are going to be primarily people that are like the baby boomers, but when they're grown up as teenagers or in college, and that's really where this movement's going to take off. There are a majority of the of kind of this youth population that are really going to take over, and it's going to take the country by storm. You are going to really see this group that rejects what they call the establishment, the man, big brother, people of kind of these middle class, traditional, conservative, not wanting to move, right, sort of values, people that don't want anything to change. They're trying to change things. They say that these people over 30 are just try to keep things the way that they are. They don't want progress. They know what's going on. They just want to keep the power for themselves, and they're trying to change and shake things up. If you've ever seen the show, one of my favorite shows of all time, That 70s Show, the character Hyde is a perfect example of a hippie, of a counterculture guy, right? These are people that reject people that represent power, authority, the status quo, the way things are. These people want change. They want to counter the culture of the time. They want to go against it. And the big thing of this gap is them and their parents and the people that are in power have very different values, very different fears and attitudes about just most anything in society. And the number one way that they really convey this, which makes it much more unique from past time periods, is they really convey all of their discontent, their anger, their feelings through music. So we are going to spend in our next lesson a large amount of time just dissecting songs like we would any other primary source, because it is a voice from these people. It's our window into the past. And really, the largest part of this counterculture group is going to be what we call the hippies. Now, not all people that go against the culture, that go against the grain, are hippies. Think about the civil rights movement. The norm at the time was segregation was normal. Segregation was what should happen. Racism was okay. The counterculture movement would question that. They want to change that. They want to flip that. So Martin Luther King Jr. is an example of a counterculture revolutionary. Cesar Chavez, counterculture revolutionary. Um, Malcolm X, even though he had a very different philosophy than Martin Luther King Jr., they also have ultimately the same core goal. They want to change the status quo. They want to change the way that things are going right now. The hippies, the same thing, but they're all going to have different goals. We've already focused on the civil rights movement, but we're going to intertwine them a couple times here. We're really going to focus on the anti-war movement, or the hippies, today. So when we're describing these people, comparing them side by side, right, you don't need to know every single word here, but really just to give you a grasp of the contrast of the type of people. So I have the black on the left and the white on the right, right? So the establishment, right, are people that want conformity. So the people that are in power now, we really want the 1950s to stay. We want that conformity. If you're part of the counterculture group, you're really kind of emphasizing doing your own thing. You want freedom of choice. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how you do it. It doesn't matter if it's weird, crazy, wacky. You're doing it because you can, and that is the core root, right? The things that the establishment or the 1950s valued, the man values, is hard work, right? Emphasis on these like 9 to 5 jobs. The counterculture group, whatever makes you happy, even if it's unconventional, it doesn't matter. It's finding your purpose, finding your center. The establishment versus the counterculture, again, the establishment is very materialistic. The 1950s were extremely materialistic. It was all about consuming and buying and owning more and more and more. Counterculture group is a little bit more minimalist, right? Take what you need, share what you have, very, very communal rather than capitalistic, right? And the establishment is much more like trust the government, right? Trust science, trust the message you get from authority figures. Meanwhile, the counterculture movement has a deep distrust for authority figures, and that's going to create a lot of resentment. Right? We're going to see this brew on college campuses. It's going to be distrust of the federal government, distrust of the head of the army, distrust of anyone. And there's going to be a lot of shakeups, a lot of changes in the status quo, which will not go over easily. There's going to be a lot of tension over it, despite the end result. So we may call these people sometimes the new left. When we're talking about the political spectrum, the left is more liberal, right? The left is more liberal, and we would describe the Democratic Party today as liberal. So the new Democratic Party, they're not going to be exactly like FDR in the 1930s, right? They're going to be really calling out this end to the Vietnam War. So the counterculture group, the hippie group, the number one issue they have, and I'm going to say this a couple times because I really want you to write this out and understand this. Their number one issue was ending the Vietnam War. The youth movement, the counterculture revolutionaries, the hippies, the kids, right? Whatever you want to call them, the number one issue that shook up politics, that really divided people, was the Vietnam War. Are you for it or are you against it? Are you about escalating it, keeping it, or are you about ending it? Think of it in the same way that maybe when you talked about a US 1 course, you talked about the Civil War, how deeply the country was divided over the issue of slavery. Should you allow it, or should you hamper it? Should you damper it? Should you split it up? Should you limit its expansion? Should you get rid of it, right? You are either for us or you're against us. There's not really a middle ground there, right? Are you for the war or are you against the war, right? And that becomes this key pillar, this key split that we're going to rotate around. Look at that, specialist. Now, when we talk about Vietnam, Vietnam was really, really dividing people. And so we talk about these people that are pro war or anti war. They usually use an analogy of birds to describe these different people. What group do you fit in? Are you a hawk? Hawks are aggressive birds, they're predators, right? They're supporting the war's goals. Now, they may not believe that everything is going well, but they do believe in containment, right? They believe in aggressively going in and forcing action, that we can't just settle down and let this happen. But there are people that are vastly against the war, and the country is really split. And I think that's what a lot of people do not get about the Vietnam War, is that there are many people that are for the war and many people that are against the war when it's happening. It's a huge split down the center of the United States. However, over time, people are going to change their viewpoints and lead more anti-war. And the anti-war group is sometimes called the doves. Doves have been traditionally a symbol of peace and prosperity all throughout world history, not US history, but world history. And so that's why it uses that sort of symbolism. These people want peace, right? We're going to see a lot of college-age kids, a lot of people of the youth movement, a lot of these hippies that are really supporting this peace movement, this anti-war movement that we're going to look at today. And the best way we can look at that is through some of these core moments in this protest movement. Probably one of the most important protests during the entire period was at Kent State University in Ohio. We'll just refer to it as Kent State. Sometimes what happened there is described as the Kent State Massacre, right? We've already used the word massacre before, like the My Lai massacre. But we're going to talk about why is this happening before we talk about what is happening, right? So Kent State is in the state of Ohio. It's a public university, and the students there start gathering on campus. But the big issue is they start protesting. The question is, what are they protesting about? First of all, the draft. So the federal government is drafting U.S. citizens within a certain age, which is basically graduating high school students, college age students, and they're being legally required to go. If you do not, you could face a federal crime, you could face jail time, you could face a series of different penalties. Whether you are for the war or against the war, it doesn't matter. If you are drafted, you are legally required to report and go. Now, people won't necessarily follow it, but they're protesting the draft. They're also protesting the President of the United States, Richard Nixon's order of bombing neighboring countries, trying to destroy the supply line. There's a lot of tension that's brewing over the war. The war is going on for too long. There's no reason we should be there. Why are we fighting? Why are we killing more kind of innocent civilians in the surrounding area? And so this tension continues to brew. And it's going to escalate, right? We're going to see how far this escalates and to what extent and why this is going to be such a key event. This protest is going to last over a couple days. It's not going to be a massacre at the beginning. On the first day, May 1st, 1970, there was this massive demonstration. Over 500 students joined this protest. They went out, they walked the streets. You can see a photo of it here. Bring all the troops home, the student mobilization movement. These are college-age kids just protesting, right? Look at this massive group of people that joined. On the second day, the kids refused to leave. They started gathering in the quad. They didn't want to leave the campus. They weren't dispersing. And the state of emergency was declared. The Ohio governor calls in the National Guard to try to dispel this crowd. The problem is the demonstrations continue on campus. The kids are not listening. They're refusing to leave. And so tension starts to build a little bit, right? But again, we haven't gotten to all out violence. There's a lot of tension. There's questions back and forth. There's disagreements back and forth. And what happens is later that night, the ROTC building is set on fire. Now, ROTC is kind of like the preparation for the army. So there's some students that they go to college and they're in this program. They volunteer to go into the U.S. Army and they are going to do their training while they're in college, get their degree, get all that. And when they graduate, they'll go right into the Army at a higher leadership position than somebody just randomly joining. Kind of like training for your job before you actually go in. Protesters are gonna light this building on fire. The firemen and the police officers were called to the scene, and these protesters start throwing rocks. They start yelling and screaming at them, and so tensions have escalated. A building arson has been committed, and people are like these first responders, firemen, and police officers are getting hit and pelted with rocks. So things are only escalating after they were being forced to leave, and they wouldn't listen. And so now the National Guard is here, now police officers are here, and the crowd's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. By the morning of this, or by the evening of the second day, the National Guard actually does show up. They finally make it to Kent State after the building's been lit on fire, after all this tension blooms up. And so the tensions are going to continue into the middle of the night. They're going to try to break up all this crowd that's around. They're going to use tear gas. They're going to arrest the protesters. And even in one case, one of the protesters is going to get bayoneted. A bayonet is like a knife that you stick on the end of a rifle. So if you run out of bullets, you can stab them. So somebody was stabbed during this protest. A protester was stabbed. So things have escalated. Now we actually have violence. We have tension. We have tear gas. We have like riot gear breaking these protesters up. And things are going to sort of disperse until we come back the next morning. The next morning, the protests actually continue. More people come back. The governor is going to issue a curfew on the campus, try to lock it down. Anybody that's out is in violation of this curfew, and so now there is legal action. The armed forces are there. There are tear gas. Somebody has been stabbed. Buildings have been lit on fire. And this is just 2 days, really, of protesting, right? It started with a massive protest in the center of town, and that was it. And it's escalated to this level over the tensions of the Vietnam War. On the fourth day, right, there was a rally that was already planned, right, and it had already kind of had its working, and this was before any of the escalation had happened. And they put in this curfew, and the people decided to go through with the rally and the protest anyway. There were over 2,000 people that crammed onto this campus in order just to protest this war, and it's going to get um, even crazier when the National Guard gets involved and they start marching towards the crowd. They tell the crowd to disperse. You have to leave. You're in violation of the curfew. The people refuse. They stay. They get louder. They continue to protest. And so the National Guardsmen then take out cans of tear gas and they chuck it into the crowd to get them to run away, right? What happens is some people start running up this hill, they start running away. Other people are going to pick up cans of tear gas, like you see the student here, and chuck it back at the National Guard. So now both groups are throwing things back and forth, right? The tensions are rising. There's clear opposition. They're clearly ignoring the rules of the government, of the National Guard, of the governor. And the crowd starts turning around, not only throwing the tear gas back, but they start throwing rocks, and they actually chase, they overwhelm the small National Guard force that was around there pushing up the crowd off the campus. They run them back to their base, and they start screaming at them. They're throwing things, get these pigs off of our campus. And then the National Guard is going to march back with their full force on the crowd. They start getting chased up by a hill. The National Guard opens fire on the crowd, and for 13 seconds, right, firing is going to continue to commence, right? And that might not sound like a long time, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start counting, right? And I'm going to just be silent for a while. What does 13 seconds sound like, right? We're going to start that right now. That was 13 seconds imagine that being straight gunshots, gunfire. That's a lot of bullets. That's a lot of damage. That's a lot of people that can get hit, right? You see people running away from the crowd, students, right? These are the people that are protesting. These students, these teenagers, these 20-year-olds, right? Are the people that are basically protesting, going against the National Guard, and this is direct opposition. They're defying them, right? It's open defiance, and the problem is with this firing, and as people open fire, 9 people are going to be wounded and 4 students are going to be killed by the U.S. National Guard. This is a massive turning point. This is probably the most famous photo of this incident, where you see this man laying down, face down on the ground, right? He's been shot dead. This girl that you see with kind of the white handkerchief around her neck standing right above, she's not even a college student. She was 16 years old. She went off to the protest because she was in the general area. She was from a nearby town, and she went there because she really wanted to stand with. She was against the war, and she felt like she wanted to protest like many other youth. And this is what she saw, right? There were many innocent bystanders involved. Of the 4 students that were shot and killed, only 2 of them were actually in the protest. The top 2 were actually in the protest. The bottom 2 were just bystanders. They were just around, and they got hit by stray bullets. So it's not even these protesters that are hit, but also innocent students. All of these 4 kids are student protesters, right? They're college age kids, and they were all killed during this protest. So this is going to be all over the news. The public is going to run wild with it. They're going to make famous songs about it, one that you're going to analyze in our next class called Ohio, where they're really going to break down what happened here. And all of this tension will just continue to build and rise. And when we look at this movement, we've talked about why, right? Why they're coming. And the biggest reason is the Vietnam War. However, when we're talking about the left here, as you see here, like the left side of government, the Democratic Party, there are massive impacts of this group and of this event. The number one thing that's really going to start to happen is there's going to be this massive demand for more freedom on college campuses, right? And events like the Kent State protests are going to be just one of the many examples of that. People want an end to racism, poverty, the war in Vietnam. right? They're asking for change first, and then they began demanding it. They start protesting, and these protests are not just in right Ohio; they are all over the country. It spreads like wildfire. They want control over everything. They want control over their course load. They want more social freedom, right? They want more moral freedom on these college campuses, and they're not going to stop until they get it. You're going to see all of these college students that are going to participate in similar events. They want to change society. They're going to participate in the civil rights movement. They're going to join on the freedom rides. They're going to join in voter registration. They're going to join at these protests and these sit-ins, even if they aren't a person of color, right? Even if they're white students, that's where you're really going to see this other big group in the civil rights movement. So all of these social reform movements are going to bind together to help each other be more successful, right? We see so many people joining this movement, regardless of their background, regardless of who they are. They realize, right, this injustice, and they're questioning the social morals. They're questioning the way things are, and they're demanding change, and they're going to fight for it. They're willing to sacrifice all these things. The largest group in American history, the loudest group in American history, the most educated group in American history, the most revolutionary group in American history, at least in the 1900s. And really, there are so many ways that we see the counterculture really move, and there are other social effects too. It's not just the civil rights movement that they're helping, it's not just the change on college campuses, right? They are going to create social norms that are completely different, right? The hippies are probably the most well known, and so we're going to really focus on them right now. They're going to try to create their own real society. They're going to change the way that they live. They're going to remove themselves from modern society and try to shake things up. There is going to be this focus, everything from the values of love and peace of everyone, of changing social norms, that we love everyone, that you don't have to be in a monogamous relationship with just one person. You can love everyone, and you should love everyone. Sexual promiscuity, drug use, right? They call it flower power, or hippie fashion. Even the way that they dress, every part of their culture is going to be about being unique, self-expression, and being different from the mainstream, challenging the establishment, challenging the man, challenging Big Brother. And we see this all throughout the country. It's not just isolated to one person. And this is this iconic fashion that everyone thinks of when you hear about the 1960s or 70s. People think, oh, the hippies, they think the colorful clothes and the Asian influences and the tie-dye and the bright colors. And that's a huge part of it, but that's only one aspect of hippie culture. For hippies and this counterculture group, right, living the way that normal society lived was unacceptable, because every part of the structure of society, down to each little strand, was all about kind of the social norm and the status quo. They wanted to create self-sustaining communities where, right, property was shared, that they could move much towards kind of more socialist ideas, but the idea that love and people can be freely shared, that land, we can all live together in communes. And so there's going to be these huge groups of people living together. They may not be biological families, but they may be more social families living under the same place, sharing everything that they have, which is a really kind of beautiful thing. But there is a lot of shakeups of these values, right? We're going to see places in Colorado or New Mexico, where this one's called Drop City, where what they did was they set up shelters. They built shelters that a bunch of people could live in this giant community underneath here. It's not about paying rent. It's not about owning land. It's about connectively, right, collectively living together, right? That sharing everything, which is a very unique idea. It can be a very beautiful idea, but it can also change up and shake up a lot of social values in the way that people live. And so it was very cavalier. You see people writing together, people not following the rules because they don't have to, right? These are people writing, they're sitting on top of the bus. They don't have to follow the rules. They don't want to follow the rules, so they won't, right? And challenging everything they see around them. We see them in kind of these farming communities, these reserved communities where there's just a bunch of people living and existing together. Now, it may not have been the highest standard of living, but it was theirs. It was different. It was self-sustainable. It was based on their values and their terms, and that was probably the most important part to them. Now, we talked about, or we mentioned earlier, that what makes the counterculture movement unique, or what makes the hippie movement unique, was the way that they express themselves. And what we're going to look at next class is all going to be about their primary source documents. And the best way to do that is to look and analyze these contents and these messages through not just their dress, not just how they lived, but what they said. And the best way to realize their message or analyze their message is going to be through their music. Um, the hippies are going to challenge everything, right? Even sexual behavior. Sometimes people call this the sexual revolution. People are going to be openly having multiple partners. Um, uh, Sex before marriage is going to be seen as common. It's not going to be seen as taboo as maybe it would be in the 1950s. And so embracing free love, right? Make love, not war. Love for everybody, right? And love with everybody, not just in the traditional ways that we'd seen in past generations. Drug use was not only just normalized, but it was accepted and praised. Especially things like marijuana becomes extremely popular in the 1960s, but also even more so than that, what they would call kind of mind bending or mind expanding hallucinogenics like LSD. A hallucinogenic is something that will make you hallucinate. It will make you see things that aren't really there. It will most definitely mess with the way that your mind works. And some people will say it's the key to, as this Harvard professor says, unlock the universe. He encourages students to turn on, tune in, and drop out, right? Turn on your mind, right? Turn on to see what's really going around you. See these negative things that are going on in our world, or turn on, right, to the injustice in the world around you. Tune in, right? Center your focus on these issues. Think for yourself and really decide how you feel about these issues, and drop out. Drop out of normal society, or even, as they would say at this time, drop acid, right? Encouraging drug use becomes extremely, extremely normal. And this is coming from a Harvard professor, who probably becomes the most infamous one, or even well known, depending on your point of view, about drug use. We see this even in the art, right? Drop acid, not bombs, and we see it in the art styles, and they say that people can see sounds and taste colors, and it bends reality as we know it, and it takes away the social constraints of the norms that we see present for us, and really, it's all about change. It's all about making things different. Lastly, right, we can see how this really transforms into cultural episodes where there's many famous deaths due to drug use and drug overdose. It's extremely, extremely common, not only just with those of the common people, but kind of amazingly famous musicians. And it's kind of this tragic end to a lot of these people, but it is a key part of the hippie culture. The last part we have to look at is, it says, the phrase can really sum this up, is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Sexual promiscuity, right? Free love, openness, drug use, right? Challenging the norms, opening your mind, and rock and roll music. There's so many different styles of music in the 1960s that we can't just typify it by a single band. There's so many different types, and they change over different periods. There's folk music, which is, it's not necessarily country, but it's more kind of singer-songwriter. It's all about the message, and it may just be an acoustic guitar and a harmonica or things like that. You're going to have R&B, which becomes extremely, extremely popular in the 1960s and 70s. And we don't really talk about this as a counterculture movement, but especially embracing it at this time, being a primarily African American music style that makes it prominent, challenging the social norms, right? When white kids in a suburb who have no experience with diversity in their lives whatsoever can experience, listen to, and participate in music from major African American music stars or artists or topical matters, that is a way of engaging a counterculture, right? Which would be more inclusion. You're also going to see electronic rock like the Beatles changing drastically over time. You see their awful bowl cuts to, by the time they get to the Abbey Road cover down here below, you see them going much more hippie like. You see their hair grown out, different styles for sure. And there's even a style of music called acid rock. Acid rock, right? Much more kind of drug overtones and questioning again the norms and constraints of society. The Grateful Dead probably being the most significant example of that. And if we want to look at music examples, the most famous example is a festival in upstate New York called Woodstock that happens during the summer of 1969. Right, this is actually the original poster for it. In White Lake, New York. It's called 3 Days of Peace and Music, August 15th, 16th, and 17th. And this was the original plan. And we're going to talk about what the plan is versus what actually happens and why this is a great example of the hippie culture and of the hippie movement here at this moment. Right, this is just another poster from it, but it's supposed to be a giant music concert. All these famous musicians are going to come, kind of the equivalent of like a Lollapalooza or a Coachella that we would have today, right? Or like Bonnaroo or whatever major concert you want to look at. But it's very, very similar, right? For this, they're selling tickets, a 1 day price, 2 day price, and 3 day price for coming to this. Even notice the colors, again, very hippie-like, very far out, colorful. Now, here's what actually happens. It wasn't supposed to be this colossal concert. It was supposed to be a good sized concert, but look how many people are crammed there. And if you notice in the back, you can see all these campgrounds of tents and trucks and everybody kind of crammed in here. And it's going to be even bigger than people anticipated. It's going to go far and wide, right? The hippies are really going to take this over, and we're really going to talk about how that's seen in the actions and how this story unfolds. They're only expecting, right, a certain number of people. They only sold a certain number of tickets, but people just started showing up, right? They didn't buy tickets. They just came, and look how far this crowd goes. You can't even see where it ends, right? For this one musician, people just started showing up. They drove onto the road, and so many people flooded into upstate New York near this farm that they were stuck on the road. That all they did was they just parked their car and they got out. They left, and they left their car there, and it didn't matter. They didn't care. Why? Because they can do whatever they want, and they felt they had that right to do so. So they did. And they went to the concert, and people didn't buy tickets. People just bum rushed and jumped the fence, and people just came in. And so there were so many people. They didn't have enough facilities. They didn't have enough showers. They didn't have enough tent grounds. People just set up camps. Some people just slept in the mud and the dirt, and they were just there for originally it was only supposed to last 3 days, but people never left. It lasted for a fourth day, and some people were still lingering around on day five. And this is really kind of summing up what the hippies are all about. They're doing everything different because they can. And so this is typically marked as kind of like the high point of hippie culture. It's really like the height, this moment, this iconic moment of people flooding to the Woodstock concert. 32 of the best known performers were supposed to be there, and they were going to show up. They're going to share their music for 3 days of peace and love. And these are some of the amazing artists and kind of what it would be the equivalent in today's money, how much they were being paid for this show. You have amazing artists all over from Jimi Hendrix to Joan Baez, Janis Joplin, Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Who, right? And all the way down to people that are paid much, much less as we go down this list, whether the Grateful Dead or Joe Cocker or Santana, like Carlos Santana, and kind of what their equivalent of what they would be paying here. There's massive differences all over, but there's so many amazing musicians. Originally, the tickets were sold, but like I said, people just showed up and they forced their way in, and it became free. They stopped selling tickets because they realized they couldn't get people. They were only expecting, right, a couple thousand people. They ended up with 500,000 people that showed up to this small farm in upstate New York because they could, and they stayed. They wouldn't leave. People, like I said, just parked their cars, and this is what it looked like, and they just walked in, and they stayed there, and they brought tents, and if they had people they didn't have enough, maybe other people would share with them, and it was all about free love, free expression, and drug use, and kind of these hippie values that we just talked about. We see this massive, unrealistically large amount of people that showed up, and they didn't have the infrastructure prepared for it, but people didn't care. Walking around naked, bathing in the nearby water, and they didn't have enough supplies, and so they were trying to share, and people openly using drugs in public, and they didn't care, and that's the big piece there. They did it because they wanted to. They did it because they could, embracing everything about what the counterculture movement is about, doing the opposite of what the norms of the 1950s would have allowed or excused. Right? Look at this image. This is unbelievable. Look how many people, the tents and the things in the background and random cars, places, and how many people are shoved onto this hillside here. And so we really just want to take a look at everything we've looked at. We've taken a lot of information, but let's just see how all these pieces fit together. Right? We talked about what the New Left means, the protest movement, the students at Kent State, these hippies, the civil rights movement, but none of them really represented the majority of Americans, although they're the loudest and the biggest moving wave. Right? There were conservatives who said they were like the silent majority, that although we weren't out there protesting, that they were still in control. Right? The youth movement was destroying American values and they were a threat to American society, right? And that's really how Richard Nixon is going to campaign and win. He's going to be anti-hippie, anti kind of counterculture movement in 1968. But he's going up against President Johnson originally, and then Johnson refuses to run, and his vice president is no better. So Nixon wins relatively easily, and that's why he's going to get that swing, and the conservatives are going to take over in 1968. However, the success of the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War protest movement, the hippies, inspired so many other groups to demand change that we've talked about in the past. And I just want you to realize how in the 60s, all of these things are happening together, right? We talk about the rise of the Vietnam War. We talk about the escalation of the Cold War. We've talked about the civil rights movement, right? The African American civil rights movement in good depth, and all of these other groups that are asking for civil rights. We see the student protest movement on college campuses, and we see the hippie movement all together. Regardless of what group is claiming and fighting for power, fighting for greater equality, we still see this movement of change, right? We still see this movement of equality. And that's what this period is all about. It's all about social change. So hopefully this gave you a good look into what we've been talking about. And this last little piece here, it'd be a nice little thing for you to kind of pause on and try to think of all the things that have changed in music, art and fashion, social values, political things that have changed for all these different groups. There's so many big things that we can hit on here. And tomorrow in our next lesson, we're going to go into the music. We're going to go into this area right here. And I'm going to make a video for us to break down that content as needed. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll get back to you as soon as humanly possible. If that's all you got, folks, have a great day.